I am going to go ahead and get us started for the evening. If you all are here, thank you for joining our live stream. As I was explaining earlier, we've had so many people that have joined us here that we have managed to overflow our Zoom room. And so we had to go to a different format for this one Zoom call that we're going to be walking you all through. If you're here listening to me right now, it's because you care about democracy, you care about our courts, and you care about Republicans trying to dismantle democracy and have our courts overturn an election in North Carolina right now that the voters hand-delivered to Supreme Court Justice Allison Riggs to keep her seat on that court. My name is Anderson Clayton. I'm the state party chair here in North Carolina, and I'm going to walk you all through a little bit about, if you're coming into this and you've got no knowledge of what our court system currently looks like, the setup and structure of it, and walk you all through a little bit about what we're going to talk about here tonight. The bulk of this conversation is going to happen after we have our Supreme Court Justice talk to you all and, really input to everybody what's happening right now in the race and also how hard the fight has been for her thus far. Justice Allison Riggs is a true fighter for our state, a true fighter for Democrats across North Carolina, and we've got every bit of the opportunity to uplift her this evening. So that's what we're planning on doing. So for the agenda, we're going to hear from Justice Riggs in just a moment. You're also going to hear from the third vice chair of the Democratic Party, Elijah King. And then you're also going to hear the state of the race from our phenomenal voter protection director, Kat Lawson. Kat's also going to do a Q&A and sort of make sure that the questions that are being asked in the YouTube chat box, which is going to be important for you all to keep using throughout the night. And it's also going to be moderated by our third vice chair, Elijah King, as well. Then we're going to go into calls to action because we know that 60,000 voters across North Carolina were challenged. We know a lot of you are joining us here tonight, and we know that you've got questions about why your vote's being challenged right now and what you can do about it. And then we're going to close out and hopefully keep you all here in under an hour. We may run you an hour and 15 minutes thanks to a little bit of our technical difficulties earlier, but we're going to try to make sure that we're snappy with it. But we also want to make sure that we answer all of your questions and that you leave this Zoom feeling like the Democratic Party is fighting for you and that you also know how to get in and help us fight this battle yourself. Next slide. So as you all know, right now, Republicans are challenging our Supreme Court race. Justice Allison Riggs has won her race by 734 votes, along with 2 recounts, both the hand-eye recount and an electronic recount in the state of North Carolina. And so our state's Board of Elections has also verified this race, right? And right now, we're at the place where a sitting judge on our Court of Appeals is challenging 60,000 ballots in the state of North Carolina right now, trying to manage to take away this election result because he doesn't like the election results. Next slide. But let's back up a minute, right? And for those of you that may not know what the North Carolina Supreme Court looks like right now, we currently sit at a 5-2 minority on this bench. So we've got 2 phenomenal Democrats, Justice Riggs and Justice Nina Earls, whose seat is going to be up in 2026 on the bench right now, against 5 Republicans in a 5-2 minority. These justices serve for 8-year terms. And what we've seen when Republicans take control of our courts, right, is gerrymandering that is allowed for our state to be partisan and racially gerrymandered, taking us from an even 7-7 congressional split to a now 10-4 congressional split in Congress, and also denying cases like the Leandro case that allowed us to fully fund public education in North Carolina versus a Democratic majority on our Supreme Court that says no to gerrymandering, gave North Carolina an even 7-7 split in Congress and actual true fair representation of the state of North Carolina, and voted to fully fund public schools in North Carolina, one of the largest economic drivers in our state. Next slide. What that brings us to is what North Carolina Democrats have been focused on for a long time, which is taking back the majority on our courts. Justice Allison Riggs's win was a huge opportunity for us to continue down the path of taking back the majority by 2028. But we can't do that without your help and without the help of voters along the way, which is what we got in November. 734 out of the 5.7 million votes cast hand-delivered a Democratic justice back the Supreme Court win in our state, which led us to being able to keep Justice Earls' seat in 26 and also managing to take a Democratic majority in 2028 when we have 3 Republican seats that will be up on the bench. It's a long game in North Carolina, but it's a game that we know is going to pay dividends to implementing and honestly increasing democracy in North Carolina in the future. And so that's what our fight is, and that's where we're at right now. But what we've seen from Republicans, right, is that they're not playing fair, they're playing dirty. And here to tell you all a little bit more about this fight and about what she's had to go through this last 3 months or 2 months since the election, but also a year and a half as she's fought to take back the seat on the Supreme Court, Justice Allison Riggs, everybody. So I'm going to turn it over to her and take it away.
Thank you so much, Anderson. Thank you all for being here with us on a Sunday evening. Just 1 week ago, I was honored to join so many of you in Halifax Mall and celebrate our win. And this last week, I know, has been really frustrating for you and for me. But let's start at what we know, which is we won this election to keep my seat on the North Carolina Supreme Court. This isn't a me thing. This was an us thing. And we did it in the face of a red wave election. North Carolina Democrats outperformed everyone in the country and showed the way forward. In tough political times, we came together and said, this is what we want for the future of our state. So I am so very grateful for that work. It meant organizing. It meant learning how to talk about our courts and talking about our courts. It meant educating voters on how to cast absentee ballots and what to do with provisional ballots. And good golly, after the election, y'all went out and you fought for every single vote to count. You chased and cured those provisional ballots from Murphy to Manteo. And because of you, I was able to hold my seat, and we were able to take the first out of 3 steps to winning back our courts for justice. Justice Earls and I have spent the last 2 years going around the state painting a picture for people about what it looks like to have good people, justice-minded people in control of our Supreme Court, and what it was going to take to get us there. We know that this work was never going to be overnight. We knew, like Anderson said, this was a long game. And that's how I'm approaching this fight now, too. It's been a long 2 years, a campaign trail, but we've put too much in collectively. We fought too hard to give up now. And I know 2 things in particular to be true. One is they messed with the wrong person by messing with a former voting rights attorney trying to disenfranchise 60,000 of my fellow North Carolinians. And they messed with the wrong people in y'all when they decided to try and nullify your voice and your votes. So I promise you that I am not going to give a single inch in this fight. I promise you that your North Carolina Democratic Party is not going to give 1 inch in this fight. And we are using this moment, making as much lemonade out of lemons as we can. There will be accountability for this. It will be past this election cycle. When judges and justices take office, they put their hand on the Bible and swear an oath to their God that they will uphold the state and federal constitution. And that means the constitutional rights of the people in this state to cast a ballot and have that ballot counted. Y'all have heard a little bit of the numbers. My opponent is challenging over 60,000 North Carolinians. Who are these people? We have seen and heard seen them, heard their stories over the last couple of months. And I want to make sure that you feel well equipped to talk about who these folks are. They are our friends. They are our family members. I don't know if y'all know, but both of my parents are on the list. They live in Durham. I saw a news article that said the NCGOP said these folks couldn't be confirmed they were who they said they were. It's like, well, for 43 years, I've known these folks to be my parents, and they've been proud North Carolina residents for some time. They retired down here to be near their daughters, like many folks who deserve their voice at the ballot box to be heard. And my dad served his country for 30 years in uniform. He was deployed in war. We can do better than saying thank you like this. They are our elected officials. We have seen over 20 Democratic and Republican elected officials be challenged on this list. They are your second vice chair of the North Carolina Democratic Party. Dr. Kimberly Hardy has run for office, has led nobly, has raised a child in this state, has taught in this state, and they want to silence her. They are folks serving abroad, whether it's on the mission field or in uniform deployed on war fronts. They are the children of uniformed and overseas citizens. We need to tell their story and lift up their voice. And we hope to continue doing that throughout the next few weeks. At core, we want to make sure everyone understands that this is a fight that we can and will win. But this is an important lesson, not just for us in North Carolina, but for us as Americans, which is our democracy is so precious and it's very fragile. And if we let our guard down, very scary things can happen in short order. In 2020, we are 4 years out of almost losing our country. This week was the 4-year anniversary of January 6th. This week in Washington, D.C., we saw a peaceful and orderly transfer of power. That's what we should be doing. It's not what we're doing here in North Carolina. So we know that our democracy we have to be vigilant. We have to be watching for the attacks. Sometimes they can be stealth. Sometimes they can start in races like mine that people may not, I know all of y'all know about my race, but maybe not everyone is following state judicial races. They may not be following this list that my opponent is challenging, but we can help people be more vigilant and avoid being the frog boiled in water who didn't notice as the temperature crept up. And so I have been, my commitment to folks is I will not let democracy die in darkness. I will be out there telling these stories of my parents, my friends, my neighbors, so that folks understand what's happening here and what happens if we say that we have the fundamental right to vote, but then when elections don't turn out the way we want them to, never mind. We're not going to ignore it. We're going to ignore that one. So that is exactly what is happening here, and it's why it's so dangerous. It only takes one example of overturning the will of the voters, of overturning a democratic election. It only takes one example for the playbook to be replicated, and the it's just can spread like a disease. So we need to fight this fight not only for ourselves, but for all of this country. We need to be telling this story. North Carolina has been the crucible for a long time of democratic struggle, and by no choice of ours, we're gonna keep it up this election. But we are going to win this fight. I need your help, and my friends at the Democratic Party are going to tell you throughout the rest of this webinar about different ways in which you can do that. I am going to depart so that you all can have free dialogue outside of my presence, but please don't lose hope. Please don't doubt our commitment to defending your right to vote and defending the choices that North Carolina voters made in this election. This is what you put us in these jobs to do, and we will not back down. So thank you all for everything that you have done. Thank you for helping me get over the finish line, and thank you for helping me defend this win.
Thank you, Justice Riggs, for being on tonight. Thank you for your time and your fearlessness in your fight right now. Everyone can go to Justice Riggs's website and also plugging a donation for her, because honestly, legal fights are expensive and we need to make sure that we are supporting our candidates. Even though an election has passed, we are still in the midst of what this is going to look like. Jonah is going to talk more about that later, but I'm hoping that everybody feels really inspired after hearing Justice Riggs and wants to make that quick cash and quick donation to her to make sure that we keep her going. And we're also sending that link to our friends too. And so we're going to populate that in the YouTube channel and in the chat box, but just so that folks are thinking about that. And I'm going to pass it over to my third vice chair, Elijah King, to talk a little bit about what our role in this fight for democracy looks like right now. But thank you, Justice Riggs, for your time, and turn it over to Elijah.
Well, thank you, Anderson, and thank you so much, Justice Riggs, for coming and joining us tonight. And thank you so much to the over 900 people joining us on the Zoom tonight, or this live stream, rather. Look, North Carolina has increasingly become a testing ground for policies and strategies set to undermine our elections, gerrymandering congressional and legislative districts, for example, imposing restrictions on voting laws, limiting access to the ballot box, North Carolinians, we have shown our power at the ballot box time and time again, including last November, defying the odds to elect Josh Stein as governor, Rachel Hunt as lieutenant governor, people like Jeff Jackson as attorney general, Mo Green as superintendent of public schools, and yes, Allison Riggs as our Supreme Court justice. Republican leaders are not only trying to cheat and take it away from you, from us as a state, but they are running a January 6th playbook, throwing everything at the wall and seeing what sticks. This is not only a fight here at home, as Justice Riggs talked about, this is a fight all across the country. They're using us as a petri dish to see what works. And we're not going to let them get away with it. And so any support you can give, the link is below in the chat, I believe. Thank you so much for joining us here tonight, and back to Anderson.
Thank you, Elijah. Next up, we're going to hear from Kat Lawson, who serves as strategic counsel for the North Carolina Democratic Party, also serves as our voter protection director, and has ultimately been a guiding light through this fight that we have been in for the last 2 months in court. And Kat's going to give you an update of the state of the race, a little history lesson about how we got here, and then we're going to go a little free for all with the Q&A. So, Kat, I'm going to pass it over to you.
All right, thank you so much. So let's get this up. So as Anderson said, we're going to start off with a little bit of background. I can get folks to confirm that they can actually see my screen with a thumbs up for those who are in the Zoom, because it's showing me black. Excellent. Love to see that. Okay, I'm going to stop that share and just talk to you all then, and we'll just keep on going. So let's talk about some of the legal background that we are dealing with, because the reality is none of this stuff started in November of 2024. The groundwork and the foundation was laid by the Republicans, both nationally and in North Carolina, long before we actually got to this particular race. So the first thing I'm going to share with you is some of what happened before November. And really, we have to go back to November 2023 to actually get kind of the origin story for the challenges that were brought in this election against by Judge Griffin against Justice Riggs. So back in November of 2023, there were some random people who consider themselves election do-gooders, they're anything but, who brought some claims to the State Board of Elections saying that they thought that there were over 200,000 people on the rolls in North Carolina who were illegitimately registered voters. And so these individuals tried to get over 200,000 voters kicked off during an administrative process from the State Board of Elections. The State Board of Elections unanimously rejected that claim. They said that, all right, we hear you. We think that there's something we need to fix about our voter registration form, but that's all. And so all 5 members of the State Board of Elections, including the 2 Republicans, agreed that there was not a problem with illegitimately registered voters, that there was not a problem that required people being kicked off, and that we could go into the November 2024 election understanding that if you had previously submitted your registration form, if you've been able to vote in the past, that was all going to be okay, and you were going to be allowed to rely on that and continue voting the same as you always had. And so once the State Board rejected those particular arguments, Republicans went to court early. They did this first in August of 2024, trying to say that there were a whole bunch, right, of 225,000 people who were registered voters who were illegitimate and needed to be kicked off. And they also filed in October of 2024 yet another lawsuit claiming that there were overseas voters, those folks in uniform, children of folks in uniform, missionaries, and people who work and study abroad in all kinds of capacities. So they also claimed in that lawsuit that these were people who didn't deserve to vote in their home state in North Carolina through all the different laws that allow those types of folks to vote, even when they are kind of representing our country, even though they're living overseas. And so all of that served as the background for leading us to November of 2024. So I'm going to try one more time to share my screen now that I changed a different setting in the midst of talking to you all. And let's see if this works. Hey, there we go. All right. So that background, right, that is the story that kind of laid the foundation for November 5th, right? Which is when we actually get to an election and we then have a whole process that we all go through that many of you were heavily involved in to make sure that everybody's votes got counted. So on November 5th, right, we all experienced that night. We woke up the next morning and went, okay, what did we win? What did we lose? And at that point, it looked like Justice Riggs had lost. At that point, Jefferson Griffin was ahead by about 8,000 votes. But we all knew and understood that, well, the votes aren't done. We have a 2-week almost canvass period where all of the provisional ballots get counted, where all of the absentee mail ballots get counted. So we knew that it wasn't over till it was over. And a lot of you volunteered and gave up time, sweat, and tears in tracking down voters for a massive chase and cure process that went from November 6th through November 15th. And so by the time we got to November 15th and we actually finished counting all the ballots that had been cast and that had been cured, we ended up having a number of Justice Riggs won by 734 votes. And so that was a immense turnaround and really was only possible because of the amount of work that was done by folks all over the state. And this is where Griffin had the opportunity to maybe say, well, I understood, I fought hard and I'm going to go away now. And he decided that he was not going to take that path. So instead, he first demanded a recount, which was fine, right? That's a normal process. So he demanded a recount, but he also then challenged 60,000 votes. He claimed that there were 60,000 votes that had been counted during this process that were cast by illegitimate voters, a subset of the exact same voters that had been challenged by the independent person, independent meaning not officially affiliated, but the individual woman who challenged the 200,000 in front of the state board of elections, and those 60,000 are also a subset of the 225,000 that the Republicans challenged in their lawsuits from August and October. And so really he's just picking up the thread of the work that had already been done and been unsuccessful so far by the state Republican and federal and national Republicans. By December 3rd, we end up with the end of our first recount, and it shows that Justice Riggs was still the winner. And so Griffin asked again for a second recount. And on December 10th, we got the results of that recount, and she won by 734 votes. The margin didn't change during those recounts. And so at that point, the only thing that Griffin had was to claim that there were votes that had to be thrown away. And so his protest challenged multiple different categories of voters. So first, he had kind of a hodgepodge of individual voter protests. So these are people who he said voted even though they weren't residents in the county where they voted, who were felons and thus weren't allowed to vote, or folks who were deceased and actually were not alive on November 5th in order for their vote to be counted. But those individual categories were really the least problematic of what he did. The overwhelming majority of the 60,000 plus voters that he challenged were under these 3 different buckets. HAVA protests, which are voter registration challenges. So these are registration forms that he claims were missing a social security number or a driver's license number. And he claims that the absence of those numbers means that those registration forms are illegitimate and should be rejected. And then he challenged UOCAVA and UMOVA voters, and those are those voters who are living overseas, but still allowed under federal and state law to vote in North Carolina. So whatever of one of these buckets you pull from, he decided that he was going to try to throw out 60,000 votes. As a counterexample, when Justice Sherry Beasley lost her race against Paul Newby for Chief Justice back in 2020, Justice Beasley asked for recounts. She brought protests trying to get more votes counted. She did not try to throw out any votes. And when she lost by 401 after that recount process, she conceded. That's the normal thing to do in these kinds of close elections. That's not going to be good enough for Judge Griffin. Excuse me, not justice, just judge. So those protests then grew into lawsuits. So part of one of the things that the NCDP did was actually file its own lawsuit. So the NCDP filed a federal lawsuit on December 6th to protect those 60,000 votes, to get a federal court to affirmatively say that the interpretation of law that Griffin is trying to use is actually wrong. Just on its face, we don't need to have a big fight about it. We don't need to have big trials about it. It's just an incorrect interpretation of law. And so that lawsuit is ongoing. We are fighting to get that determination as fast as we can but we'll talk about the other wrinkles for why it is that all of this is taking a little bit of time. When we hit December 11th, that was when the State Board of Elections actually decided that all of Griffin's protests were going to be rejected. For the voter registration challenges, that was a partisan decision by the State Board. But for the votes involving many of the overseas voters, that was actually unanimous. The Republicans agreed that those challenges that were brought by Griffin were illegitimate. And so we started to see even then that there were going to be cracks in the unity of the Republican narrative, claiming that these were all voters that needed to be discounted. And then came a flurry of lawsuits. And so the way that Griffin then decided to go about this was to pursue all kinds of different lawsuits, none of which were really the right way to go about doing this. So on December 18th, he first went straight to his mentor and Justice Paul Newby at the state Supreme Court and asked that Supreme Court with something called a writ of prohibition, an extraordinary, weird, archaic legal tool, to simply ask the Supreme Court, the state board wouldn't throw out these votes. Will you just do it for me and simply bring me onto the court yourself? Then on December 20th, when that didn't move quickly enough, he then appealed the state board's decisions, rejecting all of his protests, to the Wake County Superior Court. And then as if those two things weren't enough, on December 31st, right, which was a really great end of the year surprise for all of us, the RNC, the Republican National Committee, along with the NC GOP and the Wake GOP, filed a lawsuit in Wake County to also throw out all 60,000 ballots, this time not only for Griffin's race, but for all the races in the state. So these are the three lawsuits that Griffin and the Republicans have filed over the span of about 2 weeks in December. All three of those cases were then pulled out of the state court system and they were put into federal court instead. And so here's where we are now. Even though all those cases were moved into federal court, the federal judge there has now kicked them all back to the state courts. And so this was a situation where Chief Judge Myers, who is the judge who was given all three of those cases, he issued a decision where he said, yes, these cases involve a fundamental voting right. Yes, these cases involve constitutional rights. Yes, these cases involve the Voting Rights Act. And I could decide all of them. I have the authority and the power to do it, but I'm going to choose not to. And I'm going to choose not to based on ideas that nobody asked me to review, nobody asked me to rule on. And instead, he kicked it back within about 5 minutes of having issued his opinion. Just for those of you who are not lawyers, which none of you need to be, hopefully, to understand all of this, sometimes having a federal court give a case back to a state court can take up to 21 days. He kicked it back in 5 minutes. Chief Judge Myers was appointed by President Donald Trump to his seat in the Eastern District. And so now we have two different things happening all at the same time. So these three cases went back to their state courts. The most important one and the one with the fastest deadline was the one in front of the state Supreme Court, that bizarre writ of prohibition. And so that was where the state Supreme Court decided that it was going to stop the state board from issuing Justice Riggs' certificate of election. She won her race. Multiple recounts confirmed it. The decision of the state board regarding all of these protests also confirmed that with all legitimate votes counted, because all of these are in fact legitimate votes, she won her race. She deserves her certificate of election. But the Supreme Court has stopped that from being issued. That was not a unanimous decision. Obviously, Justice Earls, I think all of us are not surprised to know that she dissented from that decision, but also Justice Dietz, one of the Republican members of the court, dissented, saying that in his dissent that the petition, meaning Griffin's petition, is in effect post-election litigation that seeks to remove the legal right to vote from people who lawfully voted under the laws and regulations that existed during the voting process. None of that should be necessarily cause to hope that Justice Dietz or any of the other justices on the court will do the right thing, but it is a sign that what Judge Griffin is doing is truly extraordinary. It truly is something that is so extreme and so beyond the pale that even among some of the folks who are most entrenched and most involved in these Republican legal communities are having doubts and are throwing up some barriers to these efforts. So that case is sitting in front of the state Supreme Court. We also have, for the RNC's case, the DNC is now involved in that case as well in the state court. And all of these cases, we are also fighting in front of the Fourth Circuit about whether or not those cases should be allowed to continue in the state court or if they should be allowed to be back in federal court. All of us, I think, understand why it is that being in federal court is going to be better overall, because in a state Supreme Court that is 5-2, Republican controlled by an incredibly partisan Republican majority, federal court is going to be the best place for any of these voting issues to be resolved. And so there are two really important dates coming up in terms of what happens next and what can be done. So January 24th is when all of the briefings, so all the legal arguments, have to be submitted to the North Carolina Supreme Court on Griffin's writ of prohibition. So at the moment, the Supreme Court is not doing anything separate from what it has already done to prevent the issuance of Justice Riggs' certificate of election. So right now, that case is in a holding pattern. And so we are also then in a holding pattern, needing to wait to see what is going to happen and what are the arguments that are going to be made on the 24th. Then on January 27th, we have oral argument in front of the Fourth Circuit. And so this is going to be about whether all three of those cases, both of Griffin's cases and the one filed by the RNC, are able to stay in state court or if they instead belong in federal court. And so after January 27th is when we'll know about where this fight is going to keep playing out when it comes to the legal dynamic of it all. And so there are a couple different potential outcomes here that we are preparing for and that you all should know about as well. The only right and legally supportable outcome is that Justice Riggs wins, that she gets her certificate of election, that she is sworn in for an 8-year term. That is the only outcome that is supported by the votes, that is supported by the law and by precedent and by any objective measure of outcomes that you could possibly choose. But we're not here for what necessarily we believe is just the right outcome. We are preparing for everything else that could go wrong. And so that could include the North Carolina Supreme Court deciding that it's just going to throw out votes and anoint Griffin the winner. Again, there is no legal support for that particular outcome, but it's one we have to be prepared for. There's also the possibility that we face instead an extended cure process. And I put that word in quotations because nobody did anything wrong with their ballots. There is nothing to cure because there was no sickness here. There was nothing wrong here, but they're going to call it that in order to cover and to protect and to masquerade what it is that they are doing by throwing out these votes, or at least by creating more and more barriers to getting these votes counted. But it is possible that we will have a massive, massive organizing effort to make sure that all those 60,000 voters are able to go to their county boards of elections and fix the problems that the Republicans have said exist with their voter registration. And then the final kind of potential outcome here would be a special election. So for those of you who remember the CD9 efforts back in the day, when there is so much uncertainty about an election, the actual right outcome is not to simply say that one person wins or the other person should. It's to say that there needs to be a new election. And so that is the final possibility that we are preparing for strategically, and that you all should know is on the table. But these three options really would be the extraordinary, unprecedented, break all of the rules kind of outcomes. The right outcome, and the outcome we are still confident in pursuing and believing that we're going to get, is that Justice Riggs is in fact declared the winner in her race. And so with that background all shared, Elijah, what are some of the questions that came up in the chat that I can answer?
Hi, Kat. So thank you so much for that presentation. But yes, we have so many questions. So the first question is, let me see. All right, so the first question is, so what if I'm on the list? Did I do something wrong? Did my vote count? And do I need to fix my voter registration?
Yeah. So if you're on this list, you did nothing wrong. The systems and the processes for confirming voter registration have been in place for over 20 years. The statutes that these are all being brought under by the Republicans were passed in 2002. And so this is longstanding practice. You did nothing wrong. You did everything that your county board told you to do, that the state board told you to do. And when you showed up, you showed your ID or you signed an exception form and you voted, right? So no, you did nothing wrong. At the moment, your vote has been counted. It is in the mix. It has been counted. It has been processed. You are part of Justice Riggs' 734 majority win. If there is anything for you to do, you will hear from us. At the moment, there's not, because we're waiting on that January 24th and January 27th next steps to come out of the state Supreme Court and the Fourth Circuit to let us know what's going to happen next and what the next steps are going to be. If you want, you can call your county board of elections to ask them if they have a process for you to update your information. But they might tell you that there's nothing for you to do. They might tell you they don't know yet because they are also waiting on guidance from the State Board of Elections, which is waiting on the outcomes from these lawsuits. So you can call them, but don't be surprised if they tell you we don't know yet. But you will absolutely hear from us when there is something for you to do.
Perfect. And would these 60,000 challenge votes change any other result?
Potentially. We obviously don't know because we don't know how people actually voted in those 60,000 ballots. There are definitely races that are within that margin. And for the Republican challenge, right, which is the one that says we want to throw out all of these ballots for every single race, there are a lot of down ballot races that might be implicated by this. One of them would be Tricia Cotham. So we'll be keeping an eye on how that all evolves.
I have another really big question, actually. Can they also use this to decertify our state races? Or some of our state legislative races and our state races in general, I guess.
Yeah. So there were 3 legislative races that were also tied up in and included in all of these protests that Griffin brought. They signed on to it. Those races have all been certified. And so those 3 Democratic legislators who won, got their certificates of election. They have signed their oaths. They've been sworn in. They are in their offices. And so knock on wood, we're not completely done with the timeline where there could be a protest there. But to all intents and purposes, that part of it is done. And it's not something that's going to be dependent on anything happening in the courts.
Perfect. And so I have another question from the chat. So we've been putting links in the chat. What is the money needed for? Legal fees? And can we provide more details so this person can understand a little bit better?
Yeah. So I'll give you the big picture kind of perspective on legally what this looks like. So I described 4 different lawsuits. So there are 3, right, that were brought by Griffin and the RNC, and then 1 that the NCDP filed itself. There are 3 different law firms that are involved in all of these different lawsuits that are filing multiple briefs and multiple arguments and attending all of these different issues in front of state and federal court, which is extremely expensive. So, and sometimes the hardest thing to grapple with litigation is how much you don't get to be in control. Griffin files these lawsuits right on the 18th, the 20th, and the 31st. All of those came with emergency requests where he was asking the courts to do something within days of him filing it, which meant that our lawyers then had to, over New Year's and over Christmas at some points, get up to speed on what he was asking, come up with arguments, and submit them and prepare for those arguments to happen. And similarly, courts are going to do whatever they want. And so the state Supreme Court, it issued a briefing schedule, right, which is going to be documents that are about 40 to 50 pages of legal arguments that are written by the lawyers to be submitted between now and January 24th. Then the Fourth Circuit said, we see you there. We also want briefing on a related but slightly different issue. And we want all of that turned in with enough time for us to have oral argument on the 27th. So now instead of doing one set of massive pieces of legal research and writing and arguments, those same lawyers are needed to do it twice over in the exact same time frame. And so that's what the legal fees really are all going to. They're going to those teams of lawyers who are working 14 hours a day sometimes to turn around this work really quickly to make sure that we have the strongest possible arguments going into these courts to make sure that the votes get protected.
And speaking of the money part, how much is this lawsuit costing the North Carolina taxpayer? Do you
Ooh,
know?
yeah, $0 for the North Carolina taxpayer. So interesting, maybe fun fact. North Carolina does not require candidates to pay for recounts or to pay for any of these kinds of administrative appeals processes. There are upsides and downsides to that. You know, you don't want money to be the primary reason why somebody doesn't ask for a recount that they legitimately deserve,
Mhm.
but it does mean that there are very few costs to candidates who want to exploit those allowances.
Exactly. And taking it from big picture to a more personal approach, several people in the chat are asking what actions they can take personally. And so, what avenues do voters on the list have to push back on their vote being challenged?
Mhm. So that is going to go into our next steps, which I actually will kick over to Jonah. Thanks, Elijah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kat. Thank you, Elijah. So everyone, I think everyone has the same question, which is how in the world do we find our place in fighting back and fighting back most effectively? Um, Before I start, just background, I know a lot of y'all here on the call. My name is Jonah Garson. I'm the first vice chair of the party. I'm an attorney and organizer, former voter protection director, actually voter protection director for that redone 9th congressional district election, which is the congressional race redone because of Republican ballot fraud targeting poor voters and Lumbee voters and Black voters in southeastern and southern North Carolina. But so the question is, what do we do? And what can all of us, whether we are one of the 60,000 challenge voters or not, how can we find our highest and best use? So number one, and I'm going to give you 3 different action items. Each of these 3 we've spent a long time thinking about. None of this is make work. All of these we think are really high value things that everyone can do. So number 1 is about money. This litigation is super expensive. And we as NC Dems, we have been hustling to finance it. Now we are going to fight all the way in every court battle, no matter what. But we need your help in financing this because we're talking about $3 million. Okay. And that's $3 million that we would have hoped to put to our organizing programs in the state. And it's not like there's money coming in from on high. We need to pay for this ourselves. Okay. Anderson's been doing a great job of leading the fundraising charge, but we need everyone who has that way, that those means to contribute, to go ahead and contribute. Okay. Number 1. Okay. Number 2, we need you all to be prepared and on call for whatever comes next. Kat Lawson, our strategic counsel, she threw up that slide a little bit ago that showed the different scenarios. The only lawful scenario where Justice Riggs, that her win is confirmed by our court, that is the only lawful scenario. And then there are 3 scenarios where democracy is overturned in North Carolina. And in each of those 3 scenarios, there will be something, a rapid response item that we need you all to join us in undertaking. That could be a mass protest. That could be organizing and knocking doors and talking to voters for a redo election. And that could be working to cure ballots that in fact weren't sick in the first instance, okay? Registrations that weren't in fact sick in the first instance. But we need you to be on call. And by joining this Zoom, we are going to assume that you all have opted in to help us. We mean it. I mean, we really are going to need a mass mobilization, the likes of which this party has never undertaken before. So that's number 2. Okay, that's stay tuned, wait a couple weeks. We need to see what happens with these court cases. How will you know? How will you know what you are being called to do? We're asking that you follow both NC Dems and Allison Riggs on all social media. And I think there are some folks right now who are dropping some of our social media channels in the chat, but we're going to blast it out. You also, by virtue of being on this Zoom, you are registered for an email list. We're going to encourage you also to join Allison Riggs's email list. You will get the same message about what to do next, the same mass mobilization call to action that comes from both of our email accounts, okay? So we're not going to spam you. Over the next couple of weeks, you are going to get pithy, substantive updates and some real focus based on what happens in the courts. And again, we do not know what is going to happen in the courts yet. All right. So number 3, okay, you said, all right, I've heard that I can donate right now. The second step is to stay tuned and essentially wait for contingencies to pass. All right. What is number 3? What can I do right now? We need to amplify the voices of those that the GOP is trying to disenfranchise. At this point, we have contacted many of the 60,000 voters, and we have asked them to tell their stories. We know that amplifying those stories matters very much. It matters to the financial support that we're getting for this litigation. It matters to the national attention we're getting. It matters to the awareness of the 60,000 affected voters. And it matters very much to the North Carolina Supreme Court, including to the Republican justices on that court. I think you all remember what Kat Lawson or Justice Riggs or Anderson said earlier about Justice Dietz, the Republican justice on the Supreme Court, who said outright, you know, this lawsuit is shaking people's belief in the strength of our American democracy, essentially saying it's harmful. Okay, we know that the public pressure and that the state and national eyes on that it matters so much. Okay, where can you find these stories of the 60,000 affected voters? Every single day, the North Carolina Democratic Party is using its social media challenges to uplift and center those voices. Okay, look at NC Dems. Okay, and you can find us multiple places in multiple different social media channels. As was said earlier, all of this amplifying of voices raises the political costs. And what we can all do individually is raise the political costs for the MAGA GOP and try to overturn democracy as they are. If you are one of the 60,000 affected voters, if you have a loved one, someone you know who's one of the 60,000 affected voters, we're going to give you the directions for essentially filming the story, creating a story so that we can center your voice or the voice of the North Carolina voter you care about. Okay, so we're still collecting those stories, and those stories will be featured by us, and we will also use them for our advocacy campaigns going forward. There's something special happening on Tuesday, and this also goes into the what can I do right now bucket. On Tuesday, our friends at Can't Win Victory Fund are going to begin reading out the names of the 60,000 challenged voters in front of the state Supreme Court. And all of this is going to be live streamed, and it could take up to 17 hours. Okay. And so we need folks to amplify the reading of the 60,000 names. We want this to get national attention. We think it's a great idea. So that is something we want everyone to be aware of this Tuesday, up to 17 hours of reading the names of the 60,000. Okay, so number 1, we had donate. Number 2, we had stay tuned for mass mobilization, be it knocking doors, curing ballots registrations that don't actually need curing, or some sort of mass protest. Number 3, we had sharing digital content and resharing. Okay. Number 4, we know that the reason why MAGA GOP is fighting so hard is because they know that the road to democratic revival in North Carolina runs through our courts. And they know that we are fighting hard to retake the majority on our court for a democracy forward Democratic majority by 2028. And so what you can do right now is follow Justice Anita Earls, sign up for her newsletters, support her campaign, because Justice Anita Earls is up next, and she's up in 2026. Okay, everyone, what we did not share just now was a bunch of make work. We did not tell you to write X, Y, or Z person. just for the heck of it. We did not tell you to pick up the phone and call a government office that might be underwater already, okay? We put time thinking about what actually mattered for folks to do right now. And I hope that you all trust this Democratic Party enough at this point to know that we are only going to direct you to your highest and best use, all right? Last thing, North Carolina has been for a long time a model and a canary in the coal mine for what happens when to American democracy when we have an imbalance in our separation of powers. North Carolina has also been a model, continues to be a model for what we can do nationally to fight back against the worst abuses, worst derogations of democracy. So I'm glad to be in this with all of you. This whole board is. Thank you all so much. And remember, you will get all of these calls to action in a follow-up email. So no worries if you didn't furiously taking notes, get all of that down. All right, back to you all, Anderson.
Thank you so much, Jonah, for going through our call to action. I know for some of you out there, it may feel like, well, that's not enough for me and I want to do more. That's okay. We need public pressure and public opinion behind us on this one, which means if you are in a part of North Carolina that may be rural, that may be 3 hours away from Raleigh right now, you're probably not getting the same news and being inundated like a lot of folks maybe in the Triangle and maybe in our major metropolitan areas are right now with this information. And that's something that you can also help change. And so Jonah talked about amplifying your message. Reach out to your local newspaper or your local TV station. Tell them that you're one of the 60,000 voters that's being challenged. Ask them to do a story about this with us. Help us amplify this message in every corner of North Carolina. Reach out to the radio shows, the blog hosts, the people in your community that get the word out there about this. The more folks that know, I heard someone the other day talk about telling their neighbor in a grocery store line about what they had been hearing and what the Republicans were doing on the Supreme Court right now. Even if it's the whisper campaign throughout your community, it's a way that you're amplifying this message throughout your networks, and those are really important for us. And so to points that I saw made in the chat box earlier, there is already a toolkit that we have, a digital toolkit around this, and so we'll make sure to send that out in the follow-up emails. You can sign up and get our digital toolkit that our digital team from the state party makes every single week by signing up on the state party's website. So it's right there on the front page when you go to it, and it's also something that you can utilize on your own personal social medias to help us with amplification. And for folks that are looking for previous videos, they're on all of our platforms right now, Blue Skies, the X, unfortunately, and also still Facebook that are owned by our billionaires. So all the different ways. I hope that all of you, once you're leaving this Zoom call or this YouTube stream, however you might be coming in and listening to us right now, that you feel way more educated about what's going on in North Carolina. But even if Pat Lawson diving you into the legal battle and ramifications that we have been through over the last 2 months is not something that you could keep up with or follow the whole time, that's okay. The main thing that we want people in this state right now to know are that, number one, Republicans are trying to steal an election. Number two, there's something that we can do about it right now, which is raise absolute hell. And number three, that's what we're doing, both in the court of public opinion and also in our court system. And so I hope that all of you know that the Democratic Party is doing everything we possibly can to keep you all updated. Kat has done an amazing job helping be a legal strategist for us. Shout out to the entire North Carolina Democratic Party staff, Becca and Kayla and Tommy and Sarah and Lillian and Keon and Anai and folks that have worked so hard to help put this on. And also something else that was a point made in the chat box earlier. We don't know the voter registration of the folks that are on these challenge ballots because number one, we don't care. Number two, these are people that deserve to have their votes respected and counted. But we do know, to the point that Justice Riggs made earlier about who these voters are that are being challenged, a lot of them are young voters. They're people of color in our state, and they're folks that are often already discriminated against by our legal system and by our legislative system right now. And so our challenge is to make sure that we are showing up for these voters everywhere that we possibly can. And I'm really proud that all of you did that tonight. Thank you for sticking on with us. 900 of you stayed on throughout the entire time. And if every single one of you go off tonight and use your platforms to help us amplify this, more and more people are going to know about what's happening in North Carolina. To Jonah's point, we are that beacon and we are that canary in the coal mine. And so we can do that again with all of your help. So thank you to the folks that are on here. We are closing out right at 8:04. And so I think that was amazing timing, and I'm sorry about the technical difficulties when we first latched on here, but thank you all so much for joining us tonight, and stay tuned for more of information about how you can get involved and stick with us. Thanks, folks. Bye, everybody.